Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So, hello everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar today on intimate partner violence during pregnancy, facilitated by Judy Layden. My name is Brichelle Parker, and I'm the Perinatal Program Coordinator with Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies Coalition of Georgia. I will be the moderator for the talk today. A bit of what this organization is about. The Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies Coalition of Georgia, or HMHBGA, has been around since 1973. Our mission is to improve maternal and infant health through advocacy, education, and access to vital resources. We accomplish this mission through advocacy and collaboration with Georgia lawmakers and by serving Georgia communities in several different ways. We are so excited for Judy to lead our session today. Please familiarize yourself with the chat box, and we will have around 10 minutes or so in the end to ask all these questions. With that, I turn it over to Judy.
Thank you, Brichelle. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to do this presentation today. This is a topic that I got interested in about 4 years ago when Georgia Perinatal asked me to do a presentation on fetal monitoring. And I actually said I'd love to do the presentation, but I do fetal monitoring all the time. Could I please pick another topic? And they told me that I had permission to do that. So at that time, I was on the Georgia Maternal Morbidity and Mortality Review Committee, and it's a wonderful committee. It looks at deaths of mothers during pregnancy and for 12 months after the birth of a baby, to see what was causing deaths and if there are any recommendations for changes that could decrease the number of maternal deaths that we have in our state. I wasn't surprised at all to find some of the usual causes of death, such as hemorrhage, cardiovascular disease, eclampsia, and so forth. But one thing that really did surprise me was the number of maternal deaths that we had that were due to homicide and suicide. So I picked this topic hoping that I could find out more information on it and maybe think of some ways that we could decrease that as a problem in our state. So let me begin by giving you a definition of domestic violence. It is a pattern of controlling behaviors aimed at gaining power over an intimate partner. It's not just about hitting or punching. It's a pattern of assaultive and coercive behavior. It is a syndrome of dominance and control by the perpetrator, leading to an increasing entrapment of the victim. Let me now say that I have no disclosures. I have no conflicts of interest, no financial disclosures, and I do want to explain to you that there's more information on the slides than I will actually be talking about today. I don't have time to tell you everything that I want to, but I hope that you will see some things on the slides that may pique your interest so that you can look further into this problem. And I have some references at the end of the slide presentation that you will probably find will give you a great deal more information than you ever thought that you would need on the topic. So we've talked about the definition of domestic violence. I think it's important to know that until recently, wife beating was an accepted part of marriage in a lot of cultures, and the British Commonwealth law allowed a man to chastise his wife with, quote, any reasonable instrument, end quote. That was surprising to me, and it was later modified to state that the weapon used to beat her could be no thicker than your thumb. So that led to the common saying of rule of thumb. In 1895, the Married Women's Property Act gave women the right to use conviction for assault as sufficient grounds for divorce. It was not allowed to be used as a reason before that time. And then probably the next big step was the women's movement in the 1960s and early 70s, where the proliferation of shelters for battered women started being talked about and implemented. And today there are over 1,200 shelters in this country. If you'll look on the slide, you'll see that perinatal intimate partner violence is violence that occurs before, during, and after pregnancy up to 1 year postpartum and is committed by an intimate partner, such as a spouse, ex-spouse, boyfriend and or girlfriend, or ex-boyfriend and or ex-girlfriend. It's a pattern of abusive behavior by a current or former spouse or an intimate partner that is used to exert power and control over the other person, and it is against the law. So, what does this look like? First of all, intimate partner violence can happen to anybody, no matter what their gender or age, where they live, or how much money they earn, or how old they are, or their sexual orientation. So, if you look on the slide, you'll see some of the things that you may not have thought of as intimate partner abuse before. But as we go to the next slide, you can see that there are some categories of abuse. It can be emotional abuse, where there are verbal attacks or coercing a person to do things that she may not want to do. It can be isolation, where the batterer will find fault with all of her friends, her relatives, trying to separate her from those people that would give her support. It could look like threats that would harm children, pets, or some of the possessions that you have that are very valuable to you. It also may look like gender role stereotypes where, the male feels that he has privilege as a husband to dominate over the wife. It can look like economic abuse, where money is kept away from the victim so that she has no way of leaving the relationship if she so desires to do that. And it also can look like sexual abuse. This includes rape, even in marriage, or forcing someone to perform sexual acts that they feel may be immoral or may be repulsive to them. So, when we talk about intimate partner violence in pregnancy, we have to talk about reproductive coercion. So, pregnancy sometimes is the result of intimate partner violence. Sometimes it is a result of the husband wanting to keep the woman at home, occupied by children, or occupied by household tasks where she doesn't have time to be out in public with other people. This intimate partner violence also could be coercion to end a pregnancy that a woman doesn't actually want to end. Many times, women will become pregnant in some of these relationships because they think that if they become a mother or have a child for their husband, that the abuse will decrease. However, that usually is not the case, and it actually sometimes develops into child abuse later as the children grow up. This slide lists some of the statistics that are recorded about intimate partner violence. However, we have to remember that not all intimate partner violence is reported to the police. In fact, most of it is not. The ACOG committee opinion number 518 states that intimate partner violence caused 2,340 deaths in 2007, and of this number, 1,640 were female and 700 were male. So I just wanted to bring that out so that you know that this goes both ways. It can affect men or women also. The World Health Organization reports that domestic violence against women ranges vastly in the cultures that we are associated with. There's only reported 1% intimate partner violence in Japan, but as much as 32% in Egypt and even higher than that in Africa. They also report that there is a difference in ethnic groups. Minorities experience a higher prevalence of intimate partner violence than those who are not minorities. So 47.7% of non-Hispanic Black women, 46% of American Indians are Alaskan Native women, and 53.8% of multiracial non-Hispanic women have been victims of rape, physical violence, and/or stalking by intimate partners. These statistics are 30 to 50% higher than those experienced by Hispanic, white, non-Hispanic women or Asian and Pacific non-Hispanic women. There also is a report that says that the higher prevalence of intimate partner violence among ethnic minorities cannot be explained by any single factor, but seems to be related to other factors as well, such as substance abuse, unemployment, education, cohabitation of unmarried partners, pregnancy, and income source. It's also been noted that lesbians and bisexuals experience much more physical and sexual violence than heterosexual women by intimate partners. The statistics say that 44% of lesbian women and 61% of bisexual women are victims of intimate partner violence compared to 35% of heterosexual women experiencing the same lifestyle situations. So, what does intimate partner violence cost us here in the United States? Well, the economic effects are profound. It is stated that over $8 million annually is spent for direct medical and mental health care services and lost productivity in the household. Additional medical costs are ongoing treatment of alcoholism, attempted suicide, mental health symptoms, and so forth that go on after the abuse has occurred. "64% of victims indicated that their ability to work when they are in a situation like this is affected by violence. They list the key causes for their decline in productivity as distraction, fear of discovery, harassment by intimate partners at work, either by the phone or in person, and as a loss of jobs, which are due to interruption in their work at work. It is also noted that domestic violence is the third leading cause of homelessness among families, with 50% of women who are homeless reporting that domestic violence was the immediate cause of their homelessness. There are some risk factors that are more common in these situations. I want to bring your attention on the slide to pregnancy. So pregnancy is a significant risk factor. 20% of pregnant females are victims of domestic violence, and that was just a real surprise to me as I was investigating this. It's also noted that the danger to the abused woman increases if the father of the baby is not the current husband or partner, or when the partner thinks that the baby is not his. These situations put women at higher risk for abuse. So can we recognize these situations? And you probably think when you're picturing in your mind what an abuser looks like, you're seeing in your mind Robert De Niro in Raging Bull with his wife beater shirt on. But that actually isn't the way that most abusers look. No one ever plans to grow up and become an abusive partner, and that transition that they have from love to abuse can be very slow. It can be inconspicuous, and they may not even realize what's going on within themselves. In Psychology Today, in a 2013 article called Behind the Veil, Inside the Mind of Men That Abuse, the author, John Taylor, writes that men who abuse are very clever, smart, and extremely charming. They have personalities that draw people, and this is part of their art of deception and a way that they can manipulate people. One of the main problems with encounters by victims is that when they are talking with their family and various agencies about abusive behavior of their spouse, it's sometimes very difficult to believe that someone so charming could be an abuser. What is usually common in the abuser is that they have a low self-esteem and low self-worth, and they need to control something, and that something is usually the spouse. There are some common tendencies of abusers also. They seem to be very jealous. This is often disguised as an excuse for concern. They're quick to involve in a relationship and pressure their girlfriend to become committed to them very early on. They also, it's common for them to isolate their partner from their family or friends. They often are hypersensitive and get their feelings hurt very easily, and they often do not take responsibility for things that are going on in their life which they're not happy with, such as the person who loses a job often, but it's always the boss's fault, and the abuser doesn't take responsibility for that. It's also important to know, though, that women can be abusers also. Usually, when a woman is an abuser, it is more of an emotional type of abuse rather than a physical abuse, where with men, it more often is physical abuse. Sometimes in a relationship, there is even mutual abuse that never gives anyone the excuse or the reason that they can be abusers also. The victims, how can we notice what a victim looks like, or how can we recognize a victim? And I usually tell people that if you look at the person in the office next to you, or your sister, or your best friend, that's what a typical victim looks like, at least early in the relationship. Eventually, they may become a person that has a low self-esteem. They may be emotionally or economically dependent on a person. They socially isolate themselves from other people. They have a poor self-image. It may go on so far until they start contemplating a suicide or may go into deep depressions. But at first, they look just like you or I might look. Some of the common effects that occur after the abuse starts is that acutely they may seem disorganized. They may suffer from general pain that has occurred during the abuse. They may have eating or sleeping disturbances, but the longer it goes on, the more that these effects will change a little bit. Eventually, they develop phobias. They may have somatic problems. What we may see in treating our OB patients is that there will be some gynecologic symptoms that occur. The patient may be coming with complaints of gynecologic problems more often to the offices. And then after quite a long time, the patient may develop post-traumatic stress disorder, so that they will have flashbacks about the abuse that they have experienced, or they may re-experience the trauma. They also may be in a state of hyper arousal or avoidance. And I think that some of these symptoms we can pick up with patients that are in labor at times, and we must be very careful about the words that we use and some of the things that we tell our patients to do when they're in labor, such as getting in touch with their body, um, opening their legs, bringing them back memories of earlier abuse, sexual abuse, or physical abuse that they have had in the past. Also, another result that may occur on down the road is alcoholism or drug abuse, where the patient is trying to self-medicate herself to forget the situation that she's in. You've probably all heard the term battered woman syndrome, and this is defined as a group of usually transient psychological symptoms that are frequently observed in a particularly recognizable pattern in women who report having been physically, sexually, and/or seriously psychologically abused by their domestic partner. And I just wanted to bring that definition up because it is used sometimes in defense cases where the woman has murdered her abuser, not so much as an excuse, but as a description of the state of mind that some women go through when they are abused. So, what triggers abuse in pregnancy? I remember when I first noticed these murders and suicides in the committee that I was on, and I thought, who would ever harm a pregnant woman because they are so sweet and so gentle, and they're so happy at the future of their life. Who would harm someone like that? And it wasn't until I started reading more about the stresses of pregnancies that men go through, as well as women, that I realized that a pregnancy is a time of much stress in life and may instigate these abusive feelings that a person may have over the change in situations in their life. They may feel that there is a loss of control over their life, particularly if it was not a planned pregnancy. A man may start feeling that he is jealous over the baby, the attention that is going to be taken away from him towards the baby, or it may simply be a financial burden that was unanticipated or that this person doesn't think that they can handle after the birth of the child. So if you look on the internet at the deadly cycle, this is just one of the graphs that you'll see called the cycle of violence, but it sort of describes what goes on in these types of relationships. As I said before, usually the type of person that becomes an abuser is very doting over the woman. They get into a relationship very quickly. They're a little bit pushy about carrying the relationship to a higher level. So at first, the victim may feel that she's going through a honeymoon phase. Everything is great. He really cares about me. He's calling me at work 10 times a day. And this is wonderful. I feel very cared about. But eventually, in this type of relationship, argues, insults, and accusations start appearing. There's more tension in the relationship, and it builds up like a pressure cooker until there is a violent episode. So there's violence, there's assault, the woman feels like she's in danger. And soon after that occurs, we go into the fourth phase, which is apologies, promises, denials, the denial that it was his fault, that if you had only been nicer to me, I wouldn't have been violent to you. And so she begins to reassess those feelings that she had of being afraid of that person, and the honeymoon phase starts all over again until we get into the next tension building phase. Eventually, as it progresses, the apology and the honeymoon phase decreases in time, and what you're left with is the arguments and the violent episodes. So what can happen? During pregnancy, inadequate prenatal care, one reason for that is that the physical trauma that is usually assessed on the woman is on the abdomen, the breast, and the genitals, so that you can't see those bruises on her arms or her face. When that does occur, the only person that sees that part of her body is usually the obstetrician or the obstetric staff in the office. So if you notice that the woman is skipping her prenatal visits, you might wonder if this could possibly be a reason. As it progresses, depression, that, happiness of pregnancy turns into depression because maybe there isn't going to be the outcome that I had thought this would result in due to my pregnancy. There could also be increased chronic problems during the pregnancy or acute problems such as bleeding, abruption, that sort of thing, preterm labor with these women. But of course, homicide and feticide also can be an end result. So the effects on the fetus could be complications of pregnancy that would necessitate early delivery. It could be direct injury to the baby, or it could be elective termination of a pregnancy, either by coercion by the abuser or because the woman decides that she can't go on with the pregnancy. On the laboring woman, fear of pelvic exams, fear of loss of control, or it could end in relationships that aren't developing as we would like to see them as far as bonding between the mother and the baby. There also are effects on siblings in the family. I'm not going to go through too much of that except to just point you to that second point up there that child abuse is 150% higher in homes where the partner hits the wife. So it starts out with partner abuse, but then can develop into child abuse. And if you look at the last 2 points, girls are more likely to enter into abusive relationships as teens if they've been raised in families where there was domestic violence, and boys are far more likely to become abusers as teens and adults if they come from families where domestic abuse is a problem. Now, this slide talks about homicide. It is the second leading cause of injury-related deaths of pregnant women. You can see some statistics up there on the slide. As of 2002, only 17 states noted pregnancy status on death records, so the homicides during pregnancy are probably far higher than we see in these statistics that are published. You may notice the picture at the bottom, and some of you may recognize who this is. This is Laci Peterson. She was married to Scott Peterson. She was killed when she was 8.5 months pregnant. Her husband said he was going golfing on Christmas Eve morning of 2002 and started calling her family in the afternoon when he got home and said that Laci was missing. So a big search went on to find Laci, and she was not found for a couple of months. When some joggers were going by a lake and saw the body of a fetus floating in the water that was relatively in good shape. It wasn't until a couple of days later that they found Laci's body. She was very deteriorated and unrecognizable, but the thought was that her body had protected the baby until it started deteriorating so much until the baby was expelled from her body. The case ended up that Scott Peterson was convicted of murdering Laci, and a new law was formed called the Unborn Victims of Violence Act. It also is called the Laci and Connor Law. Connor was the name that was given to the baby. And this law allowed a conviction of double homicide when a pregnant woman was murdered and when it ended in the death of the fetus. Up until this time, it was very, people were very reluctant to call the death of a fetus a homicide because they thought that it would impact the abortions laws. It has not. So it is a separate law that only deals with homicide of the mother as a conviction of the baby being a separate homicide. Another thing that is a risk during pregnancy, during these domestic violence cases, is suicide. And multiple studies have found that domestic violence survivors have a higher than average rate of suicidal thoughts, with as many as 23% having attempted suicide, compared to only 3% of those who had no prior domestic violence exposure. The risk seems to be greater, dependent on the duration, the frequency, and the severity of the abuse, and the presence of other factors such as PTSD, childhood trauma, depression, and substance abuse. So I think it's important if you're dealing with these patients to look for some red flags about suicide. And the ones that sort of stick out to me mainly are when women talk about feelings of hopelessness or having no reason to live, when women are talking about feeling trapped or in unbearable pain in a relationship, or when people talk about being a burden to others. These are sort of some red flags that kind of jumped out at me as I was listing this. So who should we suspect, or how do we pick up on these patients? The CDC recommends screening all pregnant women at least once during their pregnancy and repeating that screen during each trimester and at the first postpartum visit, as some women who are victims may not disclose that information when they're first asked. I think the main thing is that we ask frequently, and during this pregnancy, that we gain the confidence of a patient that she can trust us and that we won't give out information that she doesn't want released. We also have to note that as we're doing these screenings, that it plays an emotional toll not only on the patient to have to answer these questions, but on the person who is gathering this information. How do I ask the questions? What do I do with the information? What can I do for my patient that will keep her safe? Those are all questions that we have to think about when we are gathering this information from our patients. ACOG recommends screening all women at regular intervals. And on their website, they have a list of questions when you're screening patients for sexual assault that would be very helpful for you to read just to get an idea of how do you ask the questions. So they start out with some sort of generic questions such as, has anyone ever touched you against your will or without your consent? And then gradually go into more specific answers such as, is your visit today because of sexual experience you did not want to happen? Now, the state laws on reporting domestic abuse are different depending on the state that you're in. However, reporting of child abuse is mandatory. So during your interview with a patient, if she admits that a child in the home is being abused, that needs to be reported. But you can look at the website futureswithoutviolence.org for a list of laws in your state about reporting domestic violence. So there are some guidelines for screening, and you can look through these later, but I think one of the most important things on this slide is that it is important, if you are seeing these pregnant women, to keep printed take-home resource material available if the patient wants to take it at home with them. But it's also very important not to try and force acceptance of assistance to a patient or to secretly place information in the patient's possession, such as cards or, notes that list domestic violence hotline number, anything like that, because we have to remember that the abuser is a controller, and very often they're going through the person's personal items, and if they find information such as phone numbers for the domestic violence hotline, they're going to think that they've been found out or that the wife has reported them to someone, and it may put her in more danger. I think it's also important that when we do have a patient that wants to discuss abuse to us, that we find out what form of future communication is best for them. She may not want her medical bills sent to her home so that her husband knows that she has been to the doctor. She may not want him to know that there will be a follow-up visit and that sort of thing. So find out from that person and write it in their chart on how they want to be contacted. And also, I think it's very important to respect a patient's right to choose. So, if you find out that a patient is a victim of domestic abuse and you think that she needs to get out of her relationship, I think we need to respect the patient's own privacy and know that she knows her situation better than we do. So she knows many times when it is safer for her to stay in the relationship than to try and to leave that relationship. This slide shows just some suggestions for verbal support. I think mainly we want to validate to the patient that she does not deserve to be into this situation and that it's not her fault. Also offering assistance and letting her ask for the assistance rather than trying to force it on the patient. So there are some challenges when we are dealing with these types of situations. Some of our own personal biases. If you might look at a friend or a coworker and think, well, if my wife acted like that to me, I would probably be abusive to her too. And we have to realize we really wouldn't be abusive to that person. It's just an idea in our head. But we've got to think that no one deserves to be abused, even though the thought crosses our mind at times. We also have challenges with our physical environment. If we can question these patients in a private room so that the information isn't overheard by other people. Sometimes it's hard to question a patient when the abuser just does not want to leave the room. And I know when I worked in labor and delivery, many times we would ask the husbands to go down to the registration desk to give information for her registration, just as a way of getting the patient alone so that we could let her reveal to us any information that she might want to give us. It takes time to complete the screening, but it's important to do. We also have to realize that there sometimes are cultural and language barriers when we're dealing with the patients, and we want to get someone, a medical person as a translator to talk to the patients rather than family members, because we may not want to ask the questions that we need to ask the patient with a family member present. And I think it's very important that as we're talking to these patients that we use some methods to build trust. Our body language is very important when we're talking to these patients, keeping eye contact with them, sitting at eye level, and always being non-judgmental when we're asking the questions. We also want to ask for information, but don't push for disclosure. So I think sometimes when we realize that a person is in this type of a situation, we think, why don't they just leave? But there are many reasons that people stay in relationships. Denial that it's as bad as it's heading, that, well, he only hit me, once a month. It doesn't happen all the time, so denial there. Hope that change will come. Sometimes, particularly if it's gone on for a long time, the shame of having to admit to someone else that you have sat in that situation for as long as you have. Sometimes it's guilt, thinking that if I were just nicer, he would be nicer to me, or feeling that I am the one that's causing the abuse, particularly when the abuser is telling you that. Sometimes it's just simply financial. You don't know what you do, where you'd go, what you do with your children. And then there's always fear of reprisal. What will he do if he sees that I am about to leave? And then some of it is spiritual or religious, just feeling that marriage is for life and that you need to just stay in that situation. When we are doing an intervention for a patient, there are 4 guiding principles. We want to make sure at all times that we are assessing the patient for safety. We certainly don't want to put a patient in a less safe situation by the things that we do. We also want to facilitate the patient's ability to make their own choices, not trying to push anything on them, letting them get to the point where they're ready to make a change. We also want to always stress perpetrator accountability. There's nothing that the victim does that causes the abuse. It's a problem that could be settled in another way. So the perpetrator is the person that's at fault, not the victim. And always to be an advocacy an advocate for social change. So when we're talking to patients about taking action, there are different stages of action. They usually go in the order that's listed on the slide. However, we can't push a patient to go from one stage to another. So initially, this is the pre-contemplation stage. The patient may not be concerned about the situation they're in. They may not even be aware that they're in a situation that would be considered an abusive situation. Maybe you have a friend and you say things like, "Are you going to let him talk to you that way?" And she may think, "Well, I never thought of him that being an abusive type of language." Or someone getting physical with someone that you're talking to, and they may think that it's just a love tap or it's really not that bad. So that's the pre-contemplation stage. Contemplation is when the patient starts considering change, but she's not quite ready to leave yet or file a police report or whatever. The third stage is determination, where the patient has finally decided to make a change, and then the action stage is when the patient is actively seeking help and taking steps to address the problem. So it's very hard to watch patients go through these stages, sometimes when they're very slow to get to that action plan. But again, it has to be the patient's choice. One of the things that we talked about was assuring that your patient is safe. There is a tool out there that helps to determine the likelihood of lethality or near lethality in an intimate partner relationship. If you go on the internet to dangerassessment.org, there is the tool that you can look at that consists of two parts. One is a calendar recording how often abuse is occurring, and then there's a 20-item scoring instrument. There are instructions also on this website that help determine the level of danger of the abused woman and how to look at the scoring system to help you assess the safety of the patient. Once a woman has decided that she wants to leave, a plan needs to be made. And I would have never thought of some of the things that are on this list of making a plan. I would have just thought, just leave. But it's not that easy, and you have to be prepared. If a woman's not prepared to leave, then she's more likely to come back when she doesn't need to. So things like gathering the papers and the medications that you're going to need for an extended period of time, things that help you comfort yourself, whether it's a picture of someone or a blanket or something that usually is comforting to a woman, needs to be included in those things that you prepare. Saving money, making an emergency bag so that you can grab it at a moment's notice if you feel in danger, and storing it in a safe place that you know where it is, but maybe the abuser doesn't. Also developing signals to alert children or neighbors to call 911, thinking about what are you going to do with your pets. One of the things that abusers do is to threaten pets or things that you love. So you've got to think about what you want to do about that. Practicing how to get out of the home. How would you get legal help? Where would you go? How do you get there? All of these things are part of what is done when someone seeks counseling on how to leave an abusive relationship. It should be an conversation with someone who knows how to make a plan and can give suggestions to women on how to leave. So on this slide, this is just a great website to look at. It is the domesticshelters.org. There's just so much information on this website. They looked at what had gone wrong as far as treatment of patients in the past years that they had been dealing with intimate partner violence, and they looked at some of the ideas that were attached to domestic violence early on and how they've changed. One is that very early in studying this, people usually thought that mental illness and substance abuse was the main culprit here, that this is why it was happening, and they have found that that's not true in most cases. They also started out in the early days thinking that anger management was the way to deal with the problem, and they found out that it is not an anger management problem because most of these abusers can control their anger in other situations. It's just not in the relationship with their spouse or their intimate partner. They also found it's more of a control problem rather than an anger problem. They also found that early in treatment of these problems, they felt that couples counseling was the way to go because it was a family problem, and they had changed their focus since that time to think that it is not really a couple problem, it is an individual problem. So more recently, they have discovered that a lot of these abusers were traumatized as children, and they found that in the legal system that trauma as a child was often used as an excuse for early release of criminals. And they found that that doesn't work in domestic violence cases, that the first arrest for domestic violence is an opportunity to prevent future abuse. If they let people out early, they usually give the impression to the abused person that it didn't do any good to get their spouse arrested or detained or to report it to the police. So there's a whole list of things on this website that says, the ideas that you may have, we've tried before, and they haven't, these are the ones that did not work. Some legal issues. You can look on here to see what is recommended for documentation about being specific and detailed and taking pictures of patients when the abuse is reported to them. But I also wanted to point out that the patient has a right to ask that information regarding her intimate partner violence not be included in her chart. The reason for this is that we know that with HIPAA laws, charts information should not be seen by people that don't have a right to know. But if the abuser or their family members work in a hospital or in a doctor's office, they may have access to that information. And it may put the patient in danger if that is viewed by someone who should not be seeing that. Approximately, there is a way of initiating a domestic violence protective order that can keep the abuser temporarily away from the victim, but it is important to know that half of all restraining orders obtained by women against intimate partners were violated, and about 2/3 of restraining orders against intimate partners who raped or stalked victims were violated, so they don't always work. So what is happening in Georgia? Well, it's just staggering that every year, on average, 130 Georgia residents lose their lives to domestic violence, and most of those are killed by a current or a former intimate partner. And if we look at the statistics, Georgia consistently ranks in the top 25 states for the rate at which men kill women. And in recent years, we've ranked as high as in the top 10 states. In Georgia, if a temporary protective order is obtained against a perpetrator, then the law requires that the respondent complete a family violence intervention program. It's not always enforced by the court, but these programs are 24-week programs designed to rehabilitate family violence offenders by holding them accountable and prioritizing victim safety. So, as a result, when they've looked at whether these programs work or not, there have been three steps in personal growth that have been identified as benefiting from the program. And the first one is acceptance of responsibility for abuse. The second is awareness of a range of feelings and development of empathy towards others by the abuser. And the third is a redefinition of masculinity. There's also another program in Georgia that has had some success, and it is a program called Because We Have Daughters. And the premise of this program is that violence against women is not a woman's issue, but a human issue. And it helps men connect with the perspective of the women in their lives, including their daughters, their sisters, their friends, other women that they know, so that they can say, I would not want the abuse that I am giving to my wife to happen to other women that I love. So there has been some success with that program. There are approximately 65 domestic violence programs in Georgia. They have different levels of services that they provide. I think all of them have a 24-hour crisis line. Many of them have support groups. Some of them have financial assistance, legal advocacy, and shelters. It's very difficult to find those shelters. You can look on the internet and find what counties have shelters, but not the location of the shelter. So those need to be kept secret so that the abuser cannot find the victim who is trying to get away from them. If you need help, you can give these numbers to your patients. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is up there. There's one for teens, a local domestic violence program. Those numbers are listed at the top of the screen. And then some really good websites are listed at the bottom. I mentioned before the domesticshelters.org. This one is really good. The second one is the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence. This is the site that lists the counties and the cities in Georgia with shelters. It also gives some resources for some survivors and sources for advocates. And then the last one listed here is the Georgia Commission on Family Violence. The very neat thing about these websites is that they have an escape route for the person that is viewing the site. So I went on one of those a couple of weeks ago. I think it was the first one, Domestic Shelters, and they actually have a little icon on it that says escape. And the reason for this is that if the abused person happens to be sitting at her kitchen table looking at her laptop, and she's looking up information on domestic abuse, and the abuser walks into the room, this is a way to get out of the website really quickly. I know I've been looking at things before on the website, and I didn't actually want the person that saw it to come into the room, and I'm frantically looking on how I can minimize the screen. these sites have that escape route. And what happens is that as soon as you hit escape, it takes you to a different website. So the one that I looked at took me immediately to the local weather station. Also, these are erased from the history so that if the person looks at the history of the websites that you have accessed, these websites will not be viewable by someone who views that history. So I thought those were pretty neat. This resource, this was one that I found when I was looking at the Georgia Commission on Family Violence, and I thought this was something that I really didn't expect to find. This is support for survivors of domestic violence, murder, suicide. So this is just a like a brochure for those parents who have lost their loved ones to domestic violence, or for family members whose loved ones are the abusers. What do you do with that? How do you sort out those feelings that you have for that person? So that is the front of the brochure, and here is the back that talks about murder suicide, what to expect about as far as your grief for losing a person, and what happens next, and how you heal through this. So I thought that was something that I did not expect to see on the site, but I thought it was a very much needed reference for those family members. This is my last slide. This is my information. My website is down at the bottom right there. If you need some further information, please contact me. This is something that I'm a student of. I'm still looking for more information to answer questions that I have about intimate partner violence in pregnancy. So thank you for your time today. Thank you.
Awesome. That was awesome, Judy. Thank you so much for all this great and rich information. So I'm going to check the chat box or the
Okay.
question box. And we did have one question from Alyssa Delgado. And Alyssa just asked she just asked if there would be a recording of the webinar. And Alyssa, we will actually send a recording, not a, we will send a PDF of the slides to your email, as well as the recording for this webinar will be on the Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies YouTube channel. And I will send out an email to all the attendees with the PDF and a link to a survey, and it will also speak about the YouTube channel that we have where the recording will be. Okay, let's see if we have anything else. Does anybody else have any questions? You can put them in the chat box or the question box.
Thank you, Michelle.
No problem. Ooh, let's see. Well, Judy, it looks like we don't have any more questions, but as Judy mentioned, this is her contact information on the current slide that's up. Please, please, please get her contact information. And like I said, I will be sending out an email to everyone with the PDF of the slides, a survey, as well as the YouTube channel. So I thank all of you for attending the webinar today. Thank you again, Judy, for facilitating our webinar, and hope to hear from you all soon. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Rochelle.
No problem. Thank you.